Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to call this meeting of the Bloomington City Council to order. It's a study session, and we've got 5 items on the agenda this evening. First order of business, Ms. Christensen, if you would please call the roll for us.
Thank you. Councilmember Bloga.
Here.
Mayor Bussey.
Here.
Councilmember Carter.
Here.
Councilmember Coulter.
Present.
Councilmember Lohman.
Here.
Councilmember Martin.
Present.
Councilmember Nelson.
Here.
Let the record show that all 7 members of the Bloomington City Council are in attendance this evening. First up on our agenda is item 1, is employee recognition, recognizing Tori Addison for completing the League Academy and earning a public sector supervisor certificate. Mr. Verbrugge, you're going to take this on for us?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. Good evening, everybody. We do have Tori Addison is with us, and our human resource manager, Becky Barham, is also with us. We periodically try to bring employees in front of the council when they're being recognized for good work, and this is certainly one of those cases. So I thought that before we get started with the acknowledgement of Tori, we have a special video from Dave Unmocht, who is the executive director of the League of Minnesota Cities, which was one of the hosting partners for the program that Tori just completed. So we're going to turn it over to Dave real quickly, and then we'll come back and talk about why it's an important thing to celebrate.
Very good. Can we roll the video, please?
Hello, Tori. My name is Dave Unmocht. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Minnesota Cities. The League is proud to partner with Sourcewell, Metropolitan State University, and the Association of Minnesota Counties to offer the LEAD Academy, an educational opportunity designed for employees who are supervisors or those that may be looking to move into a supervisory role. The LEAD Academy provides a unique option for cities to prepare emerging leaders with the skills needed to effectively lead within an organization, such as conflict management, leading through change, encouraging and developing others, ethics, coaching, and even more. Being a great supervisor is more than being a good subject matter expert, as you know. Learning how to lead, motivate, and influence people and teams takes practice and a commitment to personal growth and development. In times like we are in now, focusing on professional growth and development is an important priority. I'm proud of you and the City of Bloomington for participating in the program. Tori, I want to personally congratulate you for being one of the first graduates of the LEAD Academy program. I wish you all the best in your local government career. When you go the extra mile to learn how to be a better leader, you, your city, and the community are better for it. Thank you very much. All the best, and I look forward to seeing you at a future League event. Have a great day.
Thanks to Dave. And Becky, if I could invite you into the conversation, talk a little bit about why it was important for Tori to participate in this program in terms of how it helps our Human Resources Division. And then we'll certainly invite Tori in to say a few words as well.
Good evening, Becky. Welcome.
Hi. I'm still hearing the video playing.
Becky, this is Jamie. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I was at the end of the video is still playing on my end for some reason.
All right. Well, can you please just share with the council why this program is important and how it helps us in our work that the Human Resources Division does, and talk about Tori's participation, and then we'll give Tori a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to acknowledge and thank Tori for her commitment and her diligence in completing the LEAD Academy courses, even through the additional challenge that COVID-19 brought to completing the course, and for earning the public sector supervisor certificate. I know that she enjoyed the series of courses, and she gained valuable knowledge that will benefit her not only in her career with the City of Bloomington, but the city itself. As Tori is the lead coordinator for the city's supervisor training series with the city, I'm also looking forward to the knowledge that she will inject into our planning for our future supervisor training offerings at the city. So thank you and congratulations, Tori. I think there is a lot of different subjects that were covered in the LEAD Academy courses. all very valuable subjects that can be applied to improve our performance with the city. So thanks again, Tori.
Thank you so much for the recognition. I just want to say I'm really extremely grateful and thankful that I work for an organization that allows me to grow professionally as well as personally. I love to learn. I love to learn about a lot of things, and the Lead Academy was a really good opportunity not only to learn a subject matter, but to learn from other agencies and cities who were sort of going through the same things or changes that we were. So I not only learned from my instructors, I learned from the people who I saw each and every time. And it was really cool to see the evolution of the people in the class and also share our experience and grow from that. So much appreciation and thank you very much.
Thanks, Tori. And just for the council's benefit, in addition to coordinating our supervisor training program, do you want to talk just real quickly about the departments that you support in your work as a human resource representative?
I can. So I support the police department, the fire department, administration, community service, and that includes Park and Rec, clearly the DMV, as well as public health. So I really enjoy the departments I work for. They're all very different. So I also like the added challenge of getting to know exactly what they need and being proactive and reactive. But it's a really joy to come to work every day at the city.
Well, congratulations, Tori, and well done. I mean, this, as people have brought up, this to do this during a pandemic, when being away from work, to have all the other stress and everything else going on in your life, everything else, and to take it on at this time, very impressive. So I'm very impressed. Glad that you did it. Thankful that you did it, because obviously it raises the level of excellence within the Bloomington City employee pool, and it's greatly appreciated. So congratulations. Well done. Becky, thank you for having establishing a department that encourages this type of leadership and learning, and the ongoing learning and the continuous improvement. So that's another thank you that needs to go out, and to our city manager as well, Mr. Verbrugge, for kind of laying that out as the culture here in the city of Bloomington, that it's a continuous improvement, a culture of continuous improvement and wanting to get better. And I think we've seen it most definitely here. And am I reading Tori, you're one of 6 folks who actually have this recognition from the League of Minnesota Cities. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe there were 6 of us who have attended each one of the classes. There were 4 sections and 3 classes in each section. So there were many people I saw throughout all 12 classes, but there were 6 of us, I believe, 6 of us who did each and every one of the course.
Well, good job. Well done. And I think we had a little technical issues as we tried to load this on, but I'm sure we'll get it loaded up on the city website, and along with some information about the recognition that Tori received. And hopefully we can get the video and Mr. Unlocked straightened away and synced up a little bit better, so we can take a look at it and see it as it's supposed to be. So well done. Congratulations. Thank you so very much.
Thank you again.
With that, we can move on to item 2.2 on our agenda, which is a Community Budget Advisory Committee update. And the update that we're going to be hearing from co-chair Mr. Steve Peterson is a recommendation by the committee regarding the 2021 Preliminary Tax Levy. This was one of the things that we tasked the Community Budget Advisory Committee to do. The key thing that we tasked them to do was to review city budget information, review the realities around it, all the externals and internals that we had to go with, and ask them to come back to the city council with a recommendation. And I think co-chair Peterson and co-chair Peterson have done a good job leading the group, the committee, through the process, and now they're back and ready to give us a recommendation for the council to consider. So, Steve, how are you this evening? Welcome. Thanks for being here. And
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is everybody hearing me okay?
Yes, indeed. I think you're ready to go.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to share the presentation here in just a second. Let me get the right one. Yeah, so I'm here tonight to talk about the preliminary levy recommendation from the Community Budget Advisory Committee. And if you remember from the items that we had for deliverables for the committee, there were really three main deliverables. If you look at the bottom three rows in terms of reports to the city council, there's the preliminary levy recommendation, which is what we're talking about tonight, end of August. We have 3 or 4 revenue scenarios, which we'll be back in September talking about those. And then we'll wrap up the work for the fiscal 2021 budget with some budget scenarios that will come to the council in early November. I'm going to walk through a little bit of background on this topic, both just to kind of provide some context for the recommendation we're making, and if folks from the public are watching, just to understand what the committee has been working on and what we've been discussing. This slide that I'm showing right now just talks a little bit about the difference between the preliminary and the final tax levy each year. And one of the questions that people oftentimes ask when they get involved in this process is, what is the preliminary levy versus the final levy? The preliminary levy is a dollar amount that the city sets for basically a proposed amount of taxes that's going to be collected for the next calendar year. That's a maximum that needs to be set. It's an amount that gets set by the city council sometime in September. And it's used for 2 reasons. One is it does set that maximum amount. It's also used to set the proposed tax amount numbers that get distributed on the truth and taxation statement that gets mailed to each taxpayer in the city in early November. So what this chart shows is the history of the preliminary versus final levies. It's in reverse year order. And if you look over in the right 2 columns, the preliminary percentage and the final percentage columns, you'll see that, for example, for the current year that we're in, 2020, the preliminary levy that the council selected was a 6% levy, and the final levy was 4.75%. So I think the point on this slide basically is that this preliminary levy necessarily ends up being a little bit higher than the final levy, so that there's room to maneuver on the budget. So next up, I want to talk about kind of assumptions that we're making in terms of formulating our budget proposals for the budget for next year. One of the obvious things that we're off tackling is the pretty significant declines that we see in lodging and admissions taxes. We're expecting those tax revenue declines to continue in the 2021 budget. We've agreed to a couple changes that are related to taking money that had been saved for certain purposes and using it to pay for services in 2021. There's 2 of those that we've selected. One is what's called the Normandale Lake Abatement District. That's a development district that's near the 84th and Normandale area in the city. And money had been saved in that abatement district to pay for infrastructure improvements. But in terms of looking at what's actually going to be necessary there now with the changes in the economy, it's believed that we can reduce the amount that's being saved by $650,000 a year in the fiscal 2021 budget. And we're also including savings next year for replacing the pool vessel at the city's Valley View pool. That's not saying that we're not going to replace that pool vessel when it becomes necessary to be replaced, but instead we would pay for part of that by borrowing money as opposed to having saved the money up in advance. Some other assumptions that we built in is that we've agreed that we're not going to have any cost of living increases for staff for any of the open union contracts and for the non-union employees at the city. We intend to hold the internal service charges that are collected internally for services flat. And we're not planning on any increase in the debt service amount in the tax levy. And this language about the PIR capital fund, that's basically a fund that's used to pay in large part for street improvements in terms of the city. What I want to talk about next is a set of assumptions around that first bullet on this chart, which is the significant declines in lodging and admissions tax revenues. And there's really 3 scenarios that we ended up looking at. There was a worst case, a moderate case, and a best case set of scenarios that we looked at budget-wise. Maybe starting at the bottom, the best case was that we would generate about $8.3 million in lodging and admission taxes. That represented about a 1/5 reduction in the lodging taxes and a little bit less than that in the admissions taxes. And that ranges from there to what we consider to be a worst case assumption, which was the 5.15 million number that you see in that top set of numbers there. And roughly speaking, what that represents is in 2021, collecting about half of what we would have collected or what we collected in 2019 in these two important taxes that are related to the hospitality industry in the city of Bloomington. At this point in the year, for planning purposes, the committee decided to use the worst case values as the values that we were going to use for determining our planning going forward into the fall, and also in our discussions around the preliminary levy. And the reason is that we wanted to make sure that all of the risk in the budget was on the upside of the budget. And so we decided to select that set of numbers as the working set of numbers. So if we select that as the working set of numbers, then this is really the property tax levy scenario that we end up with in that situation. And the couple key things that I want to point out on this chart, I'm not going to walk through it in detail, is in the lower right-hand corner, this table in the lower right-hand corner shows you what the necessary change to the tax levy is required in order to close part or all of the gap. And just to point this out here, at 7%, for example, that leaves about a $380,000 gap in the budget. In other words, we have less revenue than we have expenses. If we have a 0% levy increase, that leaves a $4.9 million gap. The other area that I want to point out, because this is something that you'll both me talk about, and I'm guessing you'll hear the manager talk about it in a little bit, is around the property value changes. As a reminder, for taxes that are paid in 2021, the assessment that's based on are assessments that occurred with a date at the beginning of this calendar year. In other words, at the beginning of 2020. And so that was all pre-pandemic. So this chart here shows the impact of the property value changes in each of the taxing categories that occurred as of that particular point in time. This picture in 2022 is going to be substantially different. And just a little bit of foreshadowing, we're going to see a pretty substantial increase in values in residential, assuming that current trends continue. And there's obvious impacts in the value of commercial properties of the pandemic, both on office buildings and on hotel and retail. There's some pretty obvious impacts there. So one of the things that we did talk about is we talked about if you were going to talk about the amount of reductions necessary to balance the budget. What this grid kind of calls out is if you take one of these scenarios, in this particular case, the worst case scenario, and it talks about the amounts that you would have to reduce in order to cause the budget to be balanced. So if you pick, for example, if you pick the best case scenario, and we had a 3% levy increase, no reductions would need to be made in the budget if you pick that particular set of accommodations. And the reason I wanted this slide included in the deck today was just to kind of talk about how we are trying to take a worst case approach to things. And if we get data as the fall goes along that shows that that's not quite the case, we'll be able to make some adjustments all the way up to December when the council makes its final decision around the budget. But we didn't want to have to keep kind of going back to the well if we had variances on the wrong direction here. And so that's why we picked the worst case there. So one of the things that's a little bit different than how the council has talked about this is that the committee chose to have the conversation around the amount of levy in terms of annual dollars for the median value home. And you'll see that the proposal that we'll be making tonight, which is the 6.44% proposal, is really a $60 annual increase on the median value home. And so if you're wondering where the 6.44 number came out, that number is, we backed into that off of that $60 number. So I have a couple slides here that talk about the impact of this particular proposal on median value homes kind of broken up by city council district, just so that folks can get a sense of the four corners of the city and how it impacts things. So in this particular example, District 1, they picked a house with a median value of $335,700. That's the median value home in this particular area. And for a home in that area, that's a monthly change of $9.10. For District 2, the southwest corner of the city, houses are more expensive in that part of town. And so a house in this area, the median value house is $488,000. That's a $12 a month change. District 3, the northwestern part of the city, houses also up here are more expensive than the average in the city. A $489,000 house would pay about a little bit under $13 more a month on this proposal. And then finally, in District 4, the northeastern part of the city with the most moderately priced homes in the city. In this part of town, that would represent a little bit under $5 a month with respect to the proposal that we're making. So we are out gathering feedback from folks around the work that we're doing. In particular, in September, and October, we're collecting information on the plans that we have. In September, we're gathering feedback prior to making any decisions around changes to the budget. And if you go to the Community Budget Advisory Committee's website, which if you type in the URL blm.mn/CBAC, it's down here on the bottom of this slide, you can see what the schedule is and how to participate in the virtual listening sessions. And so I did mention in September, prior to the decisions that we're making, people will have the opportunity to have input then. And then when we have created the budget scenarios, we'll have listening sessions in the middle of October to receive feedback on specific parts of the budget proposals that we have put forward. The other thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about, just in terms of more detail, is around the background on the forecasting. And we had quite a bit of discussion at the committee around the city's forecast, particularly for the lodging industry. I believe personally that the city staff has better data now at this point than anybody else does with respect to the lodgings and admissions tax forecasting. And I don't think they've synthesized data from several different sources. They've had contacts with the lodging industry. And I think that the forecasts that they're creating are the best data that we have available to do that. There's really no better source of data for that. So at this point, I'm going to be available to answer questions from folks. But just to kind of sum up, our proposal is that the council select a 6.44% preliminary levy increase for the fiscal 21 budget.
Thank you, Co-Chair Peterson. The two slides that you finished with, the lodging and admissions tax forecasting, and I would agree that the city staff has a very strong handle on that now. Perhaps you could talk just a little bit more about that. For the 6 bullets that you do have on those 2 slides, could you provide a bit more information, a bit more detail behind the committee's thinking, and ultimately the trust and the belief that they have in this forecasting model?
Yeah, and so just to recap here, the 2 areas where the pandemic has particularly impacted city revenues very strongly has been in lodging taxes, which is taxes on room stays at hotel, and admissions taxes. Admission taxes in Bloomington are dominated by taxes at the amusement park in Mall of America. And the city staff gathered data from a variety of sources, both at the national level and at the local level, related to these 2 particular kinds of uses. And they use that to develop a model that they've been updating every month as they get new data with respect to this particular question of what the revenues are going to be from those particular areas. In particular, they use data from Smith Travel Research, which is a very highly regarded national firm that does forecasting around occupancy and rates in hotels. This is the same data that the Convention Bureau Board reviews on a monthly basis. It's very commonly used by hotel developers to make decisions about when a particular hotel market can support more hotels and to set values on hotels. And so this data really is super high quality data. The other measure that they pay attention to is a measure that's in the hotel industry. It's nicknamed RevPAR, which is revenue per available room. And what this measure really does is it says how much revenue can a room in a hotel generate. What they've been seeing is that this has been increasing through the summer, but the expectation is that that increase is not going to continue in the fall. And this has to do primarily with the seasonality of leisure travel demand versus business travel demand. So if you think about why people go to hotels in the summertime, it's very common for people to go on family trips. But once school starts, people tend to generally be at home more in the fall, except for holiday periods, but in the fall and spring. And so during those non-summertime months, hotel occupancy tends to be a little bit more strongly dominated by business travel. Right now, big companies aren't doing a whole lot of business travel. So for example, in the company that I work for, I have to get a corporate VP to approve my going on a business trip. And knowing my corporate VP, that's not going to happen. And that's happening in a lot of businesses where travel just isn't occurring for business purposes. So this summer, we're seeing people traveling for kind of holiday reasons for families. We don't think that that's going to continue strongly in the fall. The other source of data that the city has is we get monthly tax returns from the hotels and from restaurants and from the amusement establishments in this city. And that gives us pretty much every month real-time data that we can use to validate the forecast. And so I think many of us are hopeful that we see conditions return closer to normal in this business, but being hopeful isn't a good foundation for planning, and that's why we're tending to take a pessimistic view from a planning perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate that information, that added information. Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Peterson, for the information, and appreciate all your work on this. I know it's been long meetings for you and the committee, and you guys are doing great work. I really appreciate it. I got just a couple questions. So the recommendation is 6.44% for the preliminary levy, obviously not the final levy. You talked about that, but if I understand one of the charts you had earlier, would that be about a $700,000 reduction in the worst case scenario and no reduction in a moderate case and no reduction in a best case scenario?
So I think you were looking at this chart right here, right?
Yeah, and I'll just go on between the 6 and the 7% there, and all
that's right. So basically, I think it was the committee's feeling that we wanted to keep our options open on this. So from a scenario perspective, the actual scenarios that the committee has preliminarily started work on is a 5% scenario, a 3% scenario, and a 1% scenario. So our actual working assumptions are 5%, 3%, and 1%. We picked the 6.5%, 6.44% one because it sat in this position and it sat above that 5% highest number that we were working on. So even in our internal discussions, we're not actually having any discussions about doing a 6.44% final number. The initial final number on our high scenario that we're talking about is more like a 5% one, but we wanted some flexibility in there in case economic conditions changed. And the reason that we wanted to do that is because once we pick that number, that's not a number that we can change. And so we wanted to make sure that that number was high enough that there was some flexibility there. I think at least at this point, it's not our intent to come back with a proposal that uses it.
And I very much appreciate that, because I just want to make sure people understand that that is not the target, that is not the goal. That is to provide the city with flexibility if things deteriorate further than they have been so far, if there's another downturn in the fall or something of that nature. So thank you for that clarification. One other question for you, two other questions. You mentioned you're going to do a 1%, 3%, and 5% scenario. Just why not a 0% scenario? I know that when we kind of started these things, there was some discussion of starting at 0% as our baseline. And I personally would like to see a 0% scenario and what that looks like and how we get there.
Yeah, so I had a conversation in the kind of co-chairs meeting that Neil and I have about that, and suggested to the staff that practically speaking, we probably were going to want to talk about a 0% number. To be honest, in the committee, we did not spend a lot of time discussing the 5, 3, and 1 or a 5, 3, and 0 sort of thing. But I think that feedback is really valuable feedback, because it kind of squares with the feeling that I've had too, because I think we need to have that option in the mix when it comes back to the council.
Yeah, thank you. And then my last question is, I'm assuming there is no assumption of some type of different or new revenue stream. There's no changes in fee structure in this budget. There's no, taking a look at where we might derive sponsorship or advertising in parks and recs or something like that, because those are so unknown or, future oriented, you're looking at kind of worst case, but hopefully we can encourage staff, and staff I know is working on ideas to generate other things. This isn't including any possible thing that we could come up with for additional revenue.
No, it really doesn't include that. And so, like, one of the things that we intentionally discussed in that category is, for example, there's been some conversation about whether the CARES Act funding and the rules around that might change, and it might be able to be used for different purposes. But we only take into account things that are actually enacted legislatively. So anything, for example, like we could go to the legislature and ask them to do this, or we could go to the legislature and consider doing that. We had conversations about those sorts of things, but ultimately we came to the conclusion that we were only going to take kind of things that seem to be reasonably certain to be realized. And things like selling sponsorships and things like that are that's money that's on the come, and you have to be careful about assuming that in your budget. If we end up going and doing it and it works out and we've got an idea like that, I'm not opposed to it, but I don't think from a planning perspective we can budget for it right now.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Peterson. I appreciate your time.
Councilmember Coulter and then Councilmember Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Steve, for being here tonight. Just sort of to start off, to piggyback on what Councilmember Nelson mentioned, why not consider, for example, fee increases for like parks and rec facilities and things like that?
So we did have a conversation around fees. And there are basically, what we heard is that there's two categories of fees at the city. There are fees that are statutory fees that the city is able to collect, for example, for building permits or planning applications or things like that. Those fees are largely required to be set at a cost recovery level. And so we don't have the flexibility, for example, to say, a building permit for your shed was $200 and we're going to make it be $500. The price of the building permit's got to have some reasonable relationship to the actual cost of that. And there may be some minor tweaks to that, but the feeling is largely that those fees that are statutory fees are aligned pretty directly with what it's costing to deliver the service. So there's not a real source of revenue there. The other set of fees are for what I would call the city's business activities. And so a good example would be like park and rec sorts of things. And the conversation that we had with the staff around that, the staff explained that those fees basically exist in a competitive marketplace. And so if we offer a certain kind of class or a certain kind of activity, people who are doing that activity usually have choices where they can go and buy that. They could go to Edina and do it. They could go to Richfield and do it. And the fact is that in a competitive environment like that, you don't have the ability just to raise the price and force everybody to pay for it. And the thought there was that there might be some minor ability to change that, but that there wasn't an enormous source of revenue available on the what I call the marketplace-oriented fees to be able to generate a bunch more revenue. The one area that was discussed, but it wasn't felt that it could be implemented for fiscal 21, was about a chargeback to athletic organizations for field use. And we did hear that in Bloomington, we're in a somewhat unusual situation that the local athletic groups get field use effectively for free in nearly all cases, and don't bear any cost for using fields. The feeling was that from the committee was that we should explore whether that was the right approach going forward. But given the lead times that we'd want to be able to give people to notify them of changes on that, the committee wasn't super supportive of making that particular change for the fiscal 21 budget.
Okay, thank you. I guess I would just sort of encourage folks to continue thinking about what options might be available in terms of fee increases. I know as a council we've had this conversation before, and I know others are also of the opinion that we can probably go a little bit higher with some fees without suffering any real loss there. And then my other question, I guess this may be better directed at staff. But the chart here in your presentation right now essentially has this, I'm reading this correctly, a sort of status quo budget with the priors and the decisions that you've already made. What requires it's very tiny on my iPad, a 7.59% levy increase.
You're talking about this one right here?
Yes, that's much larger. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so I guess, the math that I have is that going from 7.59 to 6.44 is roughly about a $654,000 change. And so I guess I don't need this explanation right now, but this is, one of the points that I have sort of expanded on before, which is, we can't separate what we pay for from how we pay for it. And so I guess I would like to know, what is that roughly that $654,000? Where does that come from? What does that mean? And then the last question I have is just, thinking about this pool vessel decision, I'm wondering, has there been any discussion about other things that the city has been sort of setting aside funds for or planning to do with sort of cash funds, for lack of a better term, that could be bonded for instead, with interest rates as low as they are. And I think they're going to be low for some time. Now seems like a really good time to sort of be bold in terms of our bonding.
Yeah, so on the second one, I'm kind of in the same camp that you are, that right now when we can borrow money, as cheaply as any of us have had the ability to borrow money in our lifetimes, we should be borrowing money to pay for stuff as opposed to saving for it. Going back to I'm trying to remember what the first, you asked two different questions in one question. I'm trying to go back.
Yeah, I did. Sorry about that. The first question was, so even going from 7.59 in the chart to 6.44, where does that $654,000 come from? What is that?
So the answer is that we don't yet know. Okay. And the way this process works is that we've got three things to deliver on. We've got this preliminary levy, we've got the three revenue scenarios, and we've got the three budget scenarios, and something's got to go first. And we really, to be honest, the preliminary levy has to be done first because you, at the council, in the next couple of weeks, need to make a decision around that. And so we did not go and make any particular decision that said, if we pick this number and we got this set of things with the worst case scenario, that's what this particular package means for that scenario. We haven't had that conversation yet. So I think the answer is that we don't know.
Sure. And that's fair. And I guess I'm not necessarily sure that that's even your job. I don't know that that's necessarily something you were specifically tasked with. So that may be better directed at staff. But I guess, I just want to be clear as we're starting this conversation that, these dollar figures mean something. And so if we're going to support any number, whether it's, 7.59 or 6.44, that, we need to be clear about what that means. So I guess I just hope from staff that we have more information about that moving forward. And I think
there's no question there, Councilmember Coulter, there's no question that the 6.44 number is going to represent cuts. So if we pick this worst case scenario, we have none of our scenarios are additive scenarios. All of them are subtractive at one level or another. So it's just we just can't answer the question of what yet.
Yeah, no, and yes, I understand that, but and I think that's a really important point to make as well for the broader public. So I think that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I think it's important to note here that I'm confident we're going to have continued discussion on fees. I know they are still on the table, but what we're trying to do tonight is to set this preliminary levy just as the parameter to move the conversation along, as Co-Chair Peterson just outlined there. This is the first step. This is what we have to do first before we can have those further discussions down the line. So I don't think we haven't heard the last of fees and the possibilities and what options we might have from a fee standpoint.
Mr. Mayor, if I could just interject there on that question. I think when we discussed the potential kind of cost recovery from the sports organizations, we had some discussion about that, but I think if it's possible, if we get into the depths of the budget conversation and that thing comes back, it's possible that will end up being back in the mix. So I want to be clear that, folks are watching right now, that they shouldn't go away thinking, oh, the sports groups have been exempted from this somehow. I think we thought it was undesirable because it wouldn't provide them with a lot of notice because they typically operate on an annual cycle. But I wouldn't say that we categorically ruled it out and said we would never consider it. So
thank you for the clarification. That makes sense. Councilmember Martin and then Councilmember Lohman.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I guess just off the bat, I'll also echo Councilmember Nelson and appreciate your willingness to include a 0% look in there, just both to serve as a baseline kind of for our decision making, as well as to kind of help educate residents on what a huge lift our hospitality industry provides in terms of our overall budget. And I'm guessing once we get to the end of this and I get to take a look at all your work, I'll be closer to that end of the spectrum. So I'll speak and see. So this might also get to what Councilmember Nelson or Councilmember Coulter was asking about. So if we don't have an answer tonight, that's fine. But say we were to select a final levy increase of 4%, and we were budgeting for a worst case scenario there, but the clouds part and the sun comes down, and we end up with the best case scenario. So we've managed to close our gap and come out a little bit ahead. Once we are mid-year, what ability do we have to course correct in terms of programmatic adjustments or realizing the austerity budget we put together, assuming the worst case isn't reflecting the realities we have at that point?
I think the answer to that is going to depend a lot on the set of choices that we end up making. So, for example, if the choices that we make include headcount reductions, then typically those need to kind of be implemented for the whole year in order to be able to capture the financial benefit of that. And so those decisions would necessarily be made, as part of kind of implementing the council's decisions on the budget. So in terms of kind of the sun parting and things being better in the summertime, practically speaking, I think to the extent that there are things like that are ongoing services, we'll probably basically have made a decision for the fiscal year that we're not going to have that service. And then the money would flow through to the kind of the bottom line and be available in the strategic priorities fund for deployment in the next cycle, effectively, would be what would happen with that. There might be some limited sorts of things where there were certain things that are services that we buy that we ordinarily decided we're not going to buy it in the fall this year. Good example might be seal coating, because sometimes seal coating is done by city staff and sometimes it's done on contract. In my experience, it's been done both ways. That might be the sort of thing where you might get into March or April and decide, well, things are looking pretty good. We decided not to do seal coating on this part of the city. We'll go do that because that's the right thing to do. And we think that's with the additional revenues that we have, that's the most important thing on the list to do. But I also think that we have to just really be careful and make sure that we don't get too optimistic too early and have make decisions on too little data with respect to that. So that would be the only thing I would caution people, is that this data is, it's bumpy enough that you may have a couple of good months and then say, well, okay, now there's a month that's not so good, and then you're back in trouble. So
that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lohman.
Thank you, Mayor. Just want to say how much I enjoyed the lodging admission tax forecast bullet points, kind of getting into some of the nitty gritty there in terms of how that forecast is supported. I particularly would be interested to look at your fifth point there with each month staff gets real-time data. I'll be interested to see how that moves between those three different scenarios as that moves along. When I go back to the assumptions page, one of the questions that occurred to me is, are these all of the assumptions that we're making with these three scenarios, or are there more items that, you know, that are, they're just not listed here with those assumptions?
On the revenue side, Councilmember Lohman, those are the complete set of assumptions. So remember, we're not at the point yet where we've had a lot of decision making around the expense side of things. So all of the numbers that we're talking about are purely around kind of model revenues, and the areas where we think we have the most variability on that are the lodging and the admissions taxes. We think all of the other revenue sources are predictable within probably plus or minus 5% would be my guess. In that, that's reliable enough for budgetary purposes. But the travel related revenues are the ones where it's just very difficult to predict what's going to happen with that.
Okay, well, that takes care of my next question, because I was wondering what the risks are with those other ones that weren't necessarily there with those revenue sources. But that's good to know that we think it's going to be within 5% of that of the forecast variance with that. Typically, when I've seen these preliminary budget forecasts, they have not only just 1 year, and I know you've spoken to this in past presentations, but I've oftentimes seen staff bring back both the number for 2021, but then also for 2022. So if you make a move in this next year, here's would be the impact for the next budgetary year. And I know there's a lot of moving variances and lots of has staff put together anything like that, you know, to give us a 2-year view, or is that just so abstract and just it would be a number not worth even looking at?
Thank you, Councilmember Lohman. Let me talk about the expense side for 2022 first. I think what happens with expenses in 2022 is largely going to be predicated on what you decide to select for 21. So until we kind of go through the process over the next 6 or 8 weeks of talking about the different scenarios, the staff doesn't really have enough information yet to be able to kind of say, okay, here's what we think the expense side of that is going to be. On the revenue side, the big question in my book is going to be around the property tax situation in fiscal 22. You have a bunch of kind of interesting things that are interacting. And I know the manager plans to talk a little bit more about this, so I won't kind of go into detail on kind of the thinking around 22. But if you look at the chart that's up on the screen right now, and you look in this lower left-hand corner in the property value changes box, a lot of where the property tax situation is going to show up in 2022 ends up, how are these values going to end up changing in that time frame? Then the other risk that you have on the property tax side in 2022 is going to be around challenges to property assessments. So one of the subtleties of the tax system in Minnesota is that your property has an assessed value, but then you can go and challenge that. And you've seen during your tenure on the council that, you know, residents often come to the Board of Review and they disagree on the value of their house, and there's a conversation, Board of Review made up with real estate agents in Bloomington, and they make a decision on whether the city did the right thing with respect to people's property values. There's a similar process for commercial property, although it tends to be a little bit more focused on the court system. But the result of that commercial property decision-making process is oftentimes you don't really know how much taxes that commercial building is going to pay for a particular year until you're well into that year, because it's in the court system, it takes much longer to do. So for fiscal 22, I think the big challenge for the city is going to be around what are the modeled kind of worst case, best case, and middle scenarios on property tax collections in 2022. And where does that leave the city from a revenue perspective? Not a problem for 21 because the values all were set before the pandemic, but it's the 2022 values that are going to be the big wild card in that picture. And manager, I think, has something that he's going to share once we're talking about the presentation here.
Thank you. And I think that what you've just highlighted is one of my main concerns when you kind of get single-minded and as a council just looking at just this 1 year. I want to not lose track of the secondary year as we look at this, because I think there's some impacts there that could be substantial and may change the way we want to look at this year to what Councilmember Coulter brought forward before. So I appreciate that analysis.
Thank you, Councilmember Lohman. Mr. Peterson, you talked about the impact on homeowners. Has there been any discussion or analysis on what it would mean for renters, for multifamily units here in the city of Bloomington?
You know, we did. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We did have a discussion about that. That particular slide did not make it in the deck. I think what I can do is I can ask the staff to provide that for you. But we
have it.
Is it in the deck right now?
It's not in the deck, Co-Chair Peterson. We do have it queued up to share with the council, however.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that then. So we did talk about this and I'm looking at it's this one right here. So we did talk about multifamily properties and the 6.4% tax levy and the impact on that. And just in this chart, this is a new chart for folks on the council. The first row there, median value home, is just repeating information that we already saw in the meeting here. What the 3 rows before are is the staff picked representative properties in the city, and they looked at the proportion of the rent that is paid in property taxes. And by the way, this is prior to the renter's credit. So this would be for someone who has an income where they don't qualify for the renter's credit. What this shows you is in the blue column in the middle where it says pay 21 at 6.44%, you were a resident of Applewood Point, and you would pay about, it would be about a $8.78 increase in the monthly charge, or about $100 a year increase. If you were in the new Indigo building over in the South Loop area, that would be a $76 increase. And if you live in the South Point building, that would be a $52 a year increase. So depending on the value of the building and and how the tax system spreads the cost in there, that's kind of the range of costs that you have. And to give you an idea, Applewood Point, that would be a $2,200 rent. That would have a change in $100 in taxes.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor and council members, just to add a little bit of additional context there, following the council's lead in terms of wanting to look at things through the lens of equity, we have specifically keyed into on what it would mean, especially for people who are living in affordable housing units, and that's why that South Point one is helpful to see. That the monthly impact there is less than it would be for the median value home, because we know that obviously people who are living in affordable housing units often are in a higher category of being tax burdened, and so we wanted to see what that pass through on taxes for monthly rent is going to look like.
Thank you. Councilmember Beloga and then Councilmember Carter. Councilmember Beloga.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Steve, and thanks for the work that the committee's done. When you were before council giving some monthly updates, one of the things we asked is the 2020 delinquent tax payments and rolling those into 2021. I didn't see that on any of the scenarios that you produced. Can you talk to that for us, please?
Yeah, so thank you, Councilmember Beloga. So just to kind of restate the question, we have a couple properties in the city that represent a pretty decent sized percentage of the tax base that have yet to pay their taxes for fiscal 20. And the question is whether we are including that revenue in our 21 kind of revenue assumptions. And the answer is no, we are not. We don't include the collection of that in 21. Our operating assumption is still that would be collected sometime in 20. And so that's the approach that we're taking right there, because that's it wasn't considered to be a predictable revenue for 21. I think your point's a good one though, because if it was collected in 21, that would be available potentially to use there.
And just to refresh my memory, and you may not know this offhand, Steve, but I think we're talking in the neighborhood of $6 million.
Yeah, that's probably a staff question. That's not a number I got off the top of my head.
Mr. Verbrugge?
Mr. Mayor and council members, it is a little bit less than that. I think it's in the neighborhood of about $5.4, $5.6 million. We can follow up and get the specific.
Close enough for this discussion at least. But the other thing is with respect to expenses, and I know there was an item or two on expenses. No cost of living adjustments for staff, holding I'm just looking for that slide, so I say them all.
I can reshare here if you want, just a second. You're talking about this slide here?
Thank you, it is. So no cost of living increases for most employees. Internal service charges are being held flat. What are we anticipating or projecting for the balance of the departments? Holding those flat, increasing them by what percent? Decreasing them by what percent? What scenario went into that discussion?
Maybe this is a good question for the manager, because the manager has been off talking to the departments around kind of potential scenarios there. So I don't know, Mr. Verbrugge, if you want to talk a little bit about the conversations you've had at the department level.
Mr. Mayor and council members, Councilmember Beloga, the instructions to the department directors were to provide a reduction equal to or exceeding a specific amount that was assigned to each of the departments. And that ranged from about, I want to say about 4.4% up as high as 5.5% of the total department request for 2021. It obviously varies by department, but the total amount of departmental reductions requested was around $3.7 million. So not quite all the way to a 0% scenario using the worst case assumption, but within range of it, and certainly other options available beyond that.
And I presume that, Jamie, the no cost of living increases is part of that $3.7 million.
So the personnel costs include, the assumptions include a no cost of living increase for non-represented employees and those represented employees that did not have settled contracts. We do have two of our unions have a settled contract for 2021, our Police Federation and police supervisors. So we are contractually obligated to those at this time.
Thank you. I'll pass the baton on for now. There's one other question. I just can't bring it to mind at this second. So.
Very good. Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Peterson, for all that you're doing and the work of your committee. So I am curious to know what you have been hearing so far in some of the community listening sessions that you guys have been holding. I know that you've had at least one. I'm not sure how many others. And so I'm curious to know key takeaways for you or from others involved in those sessions. And then I assume that something that you're hearing is, that people don't want to see property tax increases. And I guess a worry that I have, and it's related to Councilmember Coulter's point, is that, of course we want to keep that at 0%, or we want to keep it as low as possible. But I wonder if once people understand the significant impacts to the services, the amenities that we have here in the city, that they would maybe feel a little bit differently. And so I guess the second part of my question is whether or not, and this may have been presented and I can't recall, there will be additional listening sessions once we have kind of a clearer picture of what those different scenarios could look like, and the impacts that it would have on some of our programs and our services here in the city.
Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to bring up the picture here. This picture here. So the first thing I want to say to answer the first part of your question is that we just have had the one listening session so far, the targeted listening session. And so I think it largely because of the point that we're in the process where we're starting to be more specific about kind of the tax and revenue implications of that. And we haven't been very specific at all about the expense ones, except for talking about things like not saving quite as much money and cost of living increases and stuff like that, which for many residents in the city, there's really no personal impact of those particular decisions so far. We did hear quite a bit of questions about taxes and wanting to make sure that taxes were under control. The meetings that we're having in September are intended to develop the budget scenarios, both from a revenue scenario and an expense scenario. And our goal is at these two meetings in October, the October 15th and October 17th meetings, that at those meetings, we effectively have concrete kind of tax and spending budget scenarios that people can react to. So that they'll have a concrete thing that we're going to spend less money on this, and the result is the taxes are going to be at this level. And those two meetings for general public input are going to be the places where people can come and give the committee feedback on that particular question. So when we put together this schedule for engagement from the general public, we wanted to have one set of sessions prior to making any decisions, which are the two that are scheduled for in September in the middle of the month. And then about 5 weeks later, there's two sessions that we get to hear feedback on the results of the decisions that we ended up making on a preliminary basis. And then we'll take that feedback. We've got a couple meetings, and then we end up showing up at the city council in early November with the final set of recommendations. It's a tight schedule. There's no question. I think we've done a good job of putting in input at the appropriate points, but given the way the calendar works, there's not an infinite amount of time to talk about it forever. So.
I assume the digital engagement platform will be live later in the fall as well for people to provide feedback on those scenarios.
That's right. So it's part of our outreach.
Mr. Mayor and council members, it went live on Friday, I believe, Thursday or Friday. So it's already available.
And it will be continuously open?
It will, and it will be updated.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Nelson.
My other questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Carter. Did you have additional questions?
The other questions that I had have been asked and answered, so thank you.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a quick follow-up for Chair Peterson regarding the engagement, just so I understand, and maybe people in the community, that the things that you had listed were related to the general public being able to have input, but you're also talking specifically with various groups, including the business community through the chamber and other groups like that. Is that accurate? And can you just talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so we have a set of targeted conversations, both what I would call kind of major constituencies in the city and groups that otherwise might not be paying attention to the process that we're kind of reaching out to make sure that their voices are included. And so we have targeted meetings with groups like that, and the business community is an example of one. Another example, which is the first one that we had, was the Latina community leaders. We had a conversation with them about what was going on here. So we have we've kind of a combination strategy where we've picked particular groups that we feel are unrepresented, and we also have general sessions like this where we'll be doing a lot of work to try to drive people to these general sessions as well to have their feedback. So really, there's an opportunity for anybody in the city to participate in this process. We don't weight the feedback from any particular group any higher than any other group. It's just more making sure that we're getting the input from as many people as possible.
Good. Thank you.
Councilmember Belogi, you remembered your question, didn't you?
Thank you. And this is one that I've been asked quite a few times and have not had the information to be able to respond to it. It may be one that's more appropriately addressed to the city manager rather than to the budget chair. But it's with respect to the assumptions that were pertaining to the reopening in 2021 of Creekside and Highland Greens. So I'll let you all decide who takes that question.
I'll go ahead, Mr. Mayor and council members. Thank you, Councilmember Beloga. The budget for 2021 assumes those facilities are operating. Since that decision wasn't made, we have only for 2020 realized the savings of not having them open. For the purposes of budgeting, they are still that's still an open question, and the operating funds are included currently.
Thank you.
Council, additional questions? Now to recap, we are being asked to consider the Community Budget Advisory Committee is recommending a preliminary levy of 6.44, an increase of 6.44% in the levy. That, as we have talked about, is the preliminary levy, which means that's the high end. It can't go any higher, and it can go lower. And as Mr. Peterson showed us, it routinely does go lower. Over the course of the years, it has every year pretty much gone lower, unless it has started at zero and remained at zero from preliminary to final levy. This is a proposal put forward to help now shape the rest of the discussion, which will be both from revenue options and operational budget options. And ultimately, we have to adopt the preliminary levy at our September 14th council meeting. And that would be the next step in this. But for our purposes tonight, without the official okay, I think I'd be looking for nodding heads or consent or just general agreement that this is where we want the Budget Advisory Committee to continue their work with this number in mind. And ultimately, as I said, we will consider the preliminary budget levy at our September 14th meeting. So, Council, thoughts on moving forward from where we are right now? And without seeing any hands up, my initial reaction is to move forward with this as our preliminary budget levy, knowing that the committee is going to come back with options of 5, 3, and 1 or 5, 3, and 0% increase, but to set this as the starting point and to begin work from this point forward, I think this makes sense. Councilmember Beloga and then Councilmember Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the work that's been done with respect to the revenue. I look at the 10 or 12 year history of the preliminary levies versus the actual levies, and it's less than 1% on average change. And I think we could be signaling then that we're headed for a roughly 5% change increase into the levy. And I think that would not be acceptable to me. I understand the difficulties that what we're doing is going to be looking at aggressive cost-cutting measures. And I think that is warranted under these times. I don't know what they look like. I don't know where they would impact the city and its residents in providing services. But I think to go on and excuse the expression, because it's certainly not that, but business as usual is what it appears, would be showing some level of tone deafness to the high unemployment that exists within our city, and those people who are uncertain what the future holds with respect to employment, reemployment, and what their unemployment situation will look like, since the additional unemployment funds are scheduled to expire before the end of the year. So going into 2021, there's a lot of questions our residents have and a lot of uncertainty. We also had a large number, probably the largest number of people since I've been on council, come to the December and January meetings, and I believe February also, asking for explanations from the council during the public comment period of the tax increases that they had and expressing their inability to absorb those kinds of increases. So I'm very attuned to that. I don't like the prospect of having to reduce services, but as the term goes, and maybe it's overused, but these are unprecedented times. We were able to reduce services during 2011, 2012, 2013, and keep the levy at zero or around that. So I think it's more than just a revenue kind of issue. We have to look at expenses, and I know that that's the future part, the next step for the budget committee, but it is difficult times, and I think that a 4% is the preliminary number that I find that's on my high ceiling to be looking at this time. And with that, I'll give the floor to others.
Thank you, Councilmember Belogan. I just want to be clear that I have no intention of passing a 6.44% levy increase. My intention was to move this process forward and give our budget committee the tools they need to work moving forward. So appreciate your comments, Councilmember. I absolutely do, and definitely remember the folks who were here last December and January and heard their stories, and much of it had to do with valuation increases in their homes, and we're going to be seeing that in 2022 as well. So we need to keep all those factors in mind. Councilmember Coulter.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And, I guess to sort of to start off, I'm going to sort of reiterate what I said earlier, which is that, I would say I could be comfortable with a 6.44 preliminary levy, knowing where that 654 grand comes from, what that means in terms of reduction of services or reduction of people or both, right? And I think that, I bring up that framing a lot because, as I've said, we can't divorce what we pay from what we pay for. And, when we have these conversations, I get very wary of picking arbitrary numbers. And, knowing, like, I agree, these are indeed unprecedented times. And I agree, a 6.44 final levy is not acceptable. It's not acceptable for me, and I don't think it would be for the community. But we have to be able to justify, not only, I think, to ourselves, but to the broader community, what does that mean? If we're going from 6.44 to 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it is, what does that mean? What are we telling the community that they are getting for the value of not paying that to the city? And I can't tell them that yet. I would like to be able to go lower than 6.442, but I can't tell the community what that means. And that's where I get concerned. And I it's an interesting thing, because Councilmember Beloga brought up the averages that we have in this presentation. And this is, those of us, and I don't by any means claim to be a statistician, but this is one of those instances where means can be just a little bit deceiving, because when I look back, I see some years where there were, not insignificant differences between the preliminary and the final. Last year it was a 1.25%. The year before it was 1.75. But then there are also years where there are much smaller differences as well. And so I think when we look at averages that way, it can be just a little bit deceiving, because there were also some years where the preliminary was not different from the final levy. And so these are indeed unprecedented times, and so I don't think there's anything wrong with having significant differences between our preliminary and our final levy. But we need to be able to justify that to the community. We need to be able to, as confidently and clearly as we can, say what that specifically means. And we're only talking about cuts. I don't think anybody realistically, like Chair Peterson said, I don't think anybody realistically is thinking an additive budget is something that's going to happen this year. So what are we talking about when we make these cuts? We're talking about services that we can't provide, people who worked for the city of Bloomington to do things that won't be anymore or won't be working as much. And that budgets have real impacts like that, and we just need to be really, really clear about what those impacts are and what they mean for our job as city government to provide these services for our community. So, like I said, I trust that staff will be able to get me the information about that difference. So I think I could probably get to 6.44, knowing that the ceiling of what I'd like to see is certainly much lower as well. But I just don't want us to divorce those two numbers, because then I think we get into abstract discussions that really don't further our values. And like I said before, budgets are the purest expressions of our values. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having with the community moving forward.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, I have a barking dog in the background. I am less concerned about the preliminary levy and the amount of that than just kind of the basis of which we approach it. And from what I heard from Chair Peterson, looking at that 0%, in my mind makes sense. I think that's something that Mayor, you had brought up early on. And that's really, instead of working down from a number, I'd like to see what that looks like and maybe work around that number as much as possible. I am very concerned about the impact this is going to have on the people that are least capable of affording it. We know the value of rental of apartments is going up, and we had some information about how that'll impact them. We have residents that are hurting, that are unemployed, that are taking wage cuts. We have businesses that have been closed for months, and when we look at commercial property valuations, they're either a tenant or an owner of a building that's going to have to pay property taxes, and that'll impact them as well. And I definitely appreciate what Councilmember Coulter says about this being, our spending and expression of our values. But I also feel that, there is our cost savings helps those people in our community that most need it. And if the more we can do of that, the better off I think we'll be. And so, is it 6.44? Maybe is it 5? That seems to be the highest level of the options that the committee is looking at, the 1, 3, and 5. Maybe you set it at 5. But again, I just want to appreciate the work of the committee to really dive into these to figure out how we can, without necessarily taking all of it as a cut to services, really be, fiscally prudent in this process. And I think they're doing a nice job on that. And we got a couple more months to work through this. And, let's set the preliminary levy where it is, but let's work together to provide the best value we can for residents and businesses in our community.
Councilmember Martin.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I guess broadly agree. We don't have the information yet to tell the community exactly what gets included in the basket of programs, services, facilities between 3%, 5%, 6.44. But despite that, at least I'm confident right now that Bloomington taxpayers, property taxpayers, are the least able they've been in my lifetime, for sure, and perhaps longer, to support the high end of that scale, regardless of what gets included in those final packages. So I think it makes sense to set it at something like 5%, continue the revenue forecasting, since that was already one notch that we were going to be looking at regardless, and then have that preliminary number be the top end of our options scale. I agree with Councilmember Nelson's point that the preliminary really isn't the hardest nut to crack here. It's going to be how are we crafting things to continue providing value to residents. But I'm not necessarily afraid of setting an arbitrary number. I know when folks across the community are going shopping, they could be heading to the grocery store and see all kinds of terrific products that would bring value to their lives, that their kids or families would love, but they're showing up with a budget. They're showing up with an arbitrary number and then making value judgment on what's going to be in their checkout basket. So I look forward to working with everybody on figuring out how to continue providing that value and what mixed in the basket. But I guess I'm not afraid to take it a couple notches lower because, as I said, I'm going to be on the low end of the scale when it's all said and done.
Councilmember Lohman.
Thank you, Mayor. I think given the information I have, it's difficult to make a decision, and I don't know that we have. Do we have another study meeting between now and September the 14th?
No, we don't. We've got a regular meeting on the 14th. That's right. Next Monday is Labor Day, so we do not have a meeting next Monday. We have a meeting on the 14th. That's our next meeting.
So I think the reality is, if that's the day we need to make a decision, I think this is the number. I think we certainly could talk about it. One of the things I appreciate that the budget committee brought forward is that they did not make their decision based on those values going up and down. They started off, or at least the way I remember, co-chair Peterson saying is that he based it on the monthly impact statement. That I really liked the city manager kind of talks about that, because a 4.5 for 1 year may not be, or 4.75 may be different in different years in terms of the impact on that median impact home. And so I think for me, when I think about values, and I think Councilmember Coulter, you've brought that up. And I think you're right about that. We've got to look at those values that we're looking at here. And I think we've got to try to strike a balance. I've always talked about that. I think we're in lean times now. And my real concern is the impact that comes in 2022, especially, we can't lose sight of, the co-chair mentioned it many times, that impact for residential folks in that pay year and how that's going to swing. And I think we're going to see some folks that are really going to be upset when they see that impact on their taxes when they come in 22. So I think we've got to kind of keep that in mind. With that in mind, I'm, given that we got to make a decision, I'm willing to come in higher here. I need to have more information about that secondary year that's out there, so that we can try to mitigate that experience for folks when we get into that. You know, my high cap is much lower than this. I cannot see how we can pass a final budget. As Councilmember Beloga mentioned, you know, we've typically come in and we only go 1% below that, but I just do not know how we could possibly pass a budget over 4.75 in terms of what we've done in the past in lean times. I just, you know, even though we have our values, and so I'll certainly keep an open mind in terms of what comes up in between that amount as we go through this process. But it's going to be very difficult for me during lean times to go anywhere over 4.75. That's where I think the preliminary budget probably should be, because I think that's where we really need to look and go lower than that. But I'll go ahead and support this number here. I support this process. I'd like to see what's going to happen at the end, but I want to let folks know now that I'd like to see this at a much lower number, probably closer to 0.
So we are, if I'm counting noses, we're about split right down the middle with folks who are, where we could start on this one, the 6.44, and folks who would like it closer to 5. And I wonder if it makes sense to, if we split it somewhere in the middle, just so we can set this as a preliminary levy and get the work continued at a 5.3, a 5.25, something like that as our starting point for the committee to continue their work. Thoughts on that? Councilmember Coulter?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, to, again, sort of repeat myself here, I'd certainly be willing to go lower than 6.44 for a preliminary levy. But we, you know, again, we need to know what that means. You know, I think I want to support a low number too, but I can't tell the community what that means in terms of the services and the programs that we offer as a city. So if staff can tell us in it doesn't need to be great detail, but if we can find out what it means for a 5.3 or a 5 or whatever, I'm fine with that. But I don't know enough to say yes or no right now, frankly.
Councilmember Nelson, is that a new hand up or an existing hand? No? So, Mr. Verbrugge, between now and the 14th, I think we'd be stepping outside of our process that we've got set up for our Community Budget Advisory Committee. But between now and the 14th, is there information that could be compiled to give a general direction of what these numbers would mean?
Mr. Mayor and council members, I think the answer to that is probably not, because the way that we are looking at the reductions is having the departments first submit their own specific reduction targets, and then we will put those in the mix with all of the departments together. So each of the departments will have their own reductions prioritized, and then we will, at staff level, figure out a way to prioritize all of the reduction targets so that when we do present to the Community Budget Advisory Committee, we're going to essentially bundle the options that are available based on the scenarios that the advisory committee has directed us to prepare. I don't think it's too difficult to go to a 0% option if the council and the committee are interested in doing that. I think the real trick here, and it's probably one that's going to be tougher for us to figure out until later in the process, is which of the scenarios we're using, if it's going to be the worst case scenario or if it's going to be the modest case. To a question that Councilmember Lohman asked a little while ago about the workings of the staff forecasting team and the data analysis that's going on, I would tell you that for most of the last several months, staff was pretty confident in the moderate case scenario that we were tracking pretty consistently with industry trends. And to the point that Co-Chair Peterson made, the most volatile and unknowable right now is the lodging and admissions tax inputs. And we were tracking nationally and locally where the trends were going. Those changed pretty significantly in the last couple of weeks, and I think that we have a little bit dimmer view at the staff level. But information has been changing by the month and sometimes by the week. So I think we're a couple months out from knowing which scenario we're going to be comfortable with the Budget Advisory Committee. Back to the original intent of your question, it isn't real possible to Councilmember Coulter and Councilmember Lohman and some others to give you an idea of what those cuts are going to be, because really that's going to be the work of the committee to look at those options and the sort of the platter of menu options that you have and make those recommendations to the council.
And frankly, if we were using the Budget Advisory Committee or we were doing this as a council-based decision-making process on the last day of August, as we're setting the proposed or the preliminary levy, I don't think that information wouldn't be here regardless. Even in normal times, that information wouldn't be in front of us now because there are so many unknowns between now and November. And so much more information that we have to put together between now and November. Councilmember Lohman?
Mayor, I might suggest either taking your route of splitting the difference, or with the absence of information that we have, and we have, in a sense, bestowed this process upon that budgetary committee, maybe it makes sense to just start off with that 6.44 and work our way down. We're not going to have that information. So here's a number, and let's work with that number and work our way down.
Mr. Mayor and council members, if I may, thank you, Councilmember Lohman. Why don't I suggest this as an option is that staff will prepare 2 resolutions. Council members can take a couple of weeks to process what you've heard here tonight, to think about the conversation. And then on the 14th, we'll have 2 options for you to choose, and we'll see where we can get a majority.
That seems practical. Others, thoughts on that? I'm seeing Councilmember Carter with the thumbs up, Councilmember Lohman, Councilmember Coulter. Why don't we plan on that? Let's, if you can come back with should we say the 6.44 and then down to the 5 or something less than 5? Let's stay with the 5. Let's go with the 6.44 and the 5, 2 resolutions forward, and we can have that discussion on the 14th and see where we end up. Anything else to add, Council? Co-Chair Peterson, be sure to extend our heartfelt thanks to you, the members of your committee, the great work that they're putting forward doing this. I know it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of hours, and it's a lot of tough decision making, and as a volunteer committee, it's greatly appreciated. You folks are doing great work, and really appreciate the thoughtfulness that you're putting into it, and the looking at the different options and looking at the totality of it all, which I think is the biggest question and the biggest issue that we have to deal with here, and it's not going to get any easier. But thank you so very much for doing it. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks for your kind words, Mr. Mayor.
Anything else to add, Council? If not, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Have a good evening. And we will move on to item 2.3, which is a Hennepin County Youth Sports Grants for Sports Equipment. Mr. Verbrugge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. For a study session, this is a rather unique item, and they're actually asking for an action by the council. The history on this is that Hennepin County, as part of their youth sports grant program, agreed at the end of 2019 to provide a grant to Success Academy to help them build a playground and new facility on their site at 8201 Park Avenue. And the process for the Hennepin Youth Sports Grants requires a resolution of support from the local host. And when Hennepin County passed this at the time, they didn't have that expression of support. As they've tried to get the paperwork taken care of, they don't have that host agreement in place, and so we agreed to bring this to the council and just have you pass a resolution supporting this process. It is a straight pass-through of funds from Hennepin County to Success Academy. Success Academy is in the process right now of, I believe, completing the construction on their playground equipment, which is a little bit of the urgency here. We'll essentially administer the grant, so we'll have an agreement with Hennepin County, and then we have an agreement with Success Academy as a sub. They'll have a subrecipient grant agreement that they would have to produce information for us in order to facilitate that pass-through. So there's no city money that's involved here. It's just we'll have a little bit of staff time to manage the paperwork.
Very good. Councilmember Beloga, question?
Yes, I have one, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Manager, I recall that there's a state law prohibiting the gifting of money to a business. This is a nonprofit, so it may be different, but I'm sure we've looked at that, but could you explain that, please?
Mr. Mayor and council members, Councilmember Beloga, Success Academy is a charter school. And so I believe that they fit into that category of eligibility based on other schools' applicability. And that legality is a question that would have had to be satisfied to Hennepin County's determination because ultimately it's Hennepin County money that's being directed to Success Academy.
Thank you for that. And I assumed all that occurred, but for those watching, I wanted to bring that to the forefront of the discussion.
Let's hope that has occurred. Absolutely. Council, other questions, comments? As Mr. Verbrugge said, typically in our study sessions, we do not take official and formal action, although it's not prohibited for us to do so. And this was part of the formal agenda, and folks know that it is on the agenda and will be a decision made by the council this evening. Mr. Verbrugge did say it's a straight pass-through from Hennepin County through us as the sponsors to Success Academy, so a straight pass-through right over to Success Academy for their playground equipment. So if additional questions, Councilmember Beloga?
If there are none, I'd be willing to offer the motion.
Councilmember Nelson, did you have a question, or were you going to move it as well?
I had a question.
Please.
One, so this will be on Success Academy property. Is that accurate?
Mr. Verbrugge?
Success Academy is a tenant at 8201 Park Avenue, so they have to work that out with the owner of the property, but yes.
Okay. It won't be on the city property or the park or
that is correct.
That. Correct. Okay. Will it change anything with regards to our joint use, shared use, whatever that agreement is called, in that area? Or for the
Mr. Mayor and council members, Councilmember Nelson, no change to our joint use agreement is required. They were just working with our planning department to make sure that they had some setback issues and any other permissions for the actual siting of the playground worked out.
Well, that's great. I think kids being active and outside and playing is fantastic. So appreciate Hennepin County being able to help them out with this. So thank you.
Any additional questions, Council? Councilmember Beloga.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I move the resolution of support for the Hennepin County Youth Sports Grant for playground equipment.
Second.
We got a motion by Councilmember Beloga and a second by Councilmember Carter to approve the resolution of support for Hennepin County Youth Sports Grant for playground equipment. Council, further discussion? Hearing none. Ms. Christensen.
Thank you. Beloga?
Aye.
Mayor Bussey?
Aye.
Carter?
Aye.
Coulter?
Aye.
Lohman?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. So So congratulations, Success Academy, and thanks to Hennepin County, the Board of Commissioners, and especially our Commissioner, Commissioner Debbie Gattell, for her work on this. I know she did put in a lot of time and effort on this. And to the rest of the Board of Commissioners and the Youth Sports Program for the funding available to do this. And I know it will be greatly appreciated by friends at Success Academy. On to our next item, which is our City Council Policy and Issue Update. Mr. Verbrugge.
Mr. Mayor and Council Member, I don't have any issue or policy specifically. I did want to acknowledge that we had overnight what I think was probably a scary event in the neighborhood of the 84th and 15th with a standoff situation, a very unfortunate homicide of one individual and two others who were injured. And so the primary reason I want to mention this one, if residents weren't aware, that the suspect in that situation was arrested after the standoff. There's no continuing danger to the community. But second is really to acknowledge our public safety team, our police officers, and we had fire department staff also out there working the scene for multiple hours. And before it concluded, then the rain started to move in. It was a challenging, emotional, difficult scene, and it makes me appreciate again the work that our police and fire department do to protect our residents in multiple different ways. And that was a situation where it looked like that person wasn't going to come out, and they were able to facilitate a successful surrender. So that speaks to the professionalism of our department.
Couldn't agree more. Outstanding work once again by our Bloomington Police and Fire, and as always, we appreciate and thank them for the great work that they do. Council, any issues or policy updates to add? All right, seeing none, our final agenda item tonight is a closed session with the attorney-client privilege. As you all know, the Minnesota state law permits cities and other public bodies to go into closed session for a variety of different reasons, not a lot of them, but a variety of them, including negotiations on contracts or, in this case, to consider litigation. And we will be going into closed session here to discuss just that. And Ms. Manderscheid, are you on the line with us here? Standing by for Ms. Manderscheid?
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. Yes, I am on the line.
Good evening.
I'll just note on the resolution, there's a resolution in the packet to close the meeting that covers the statutory requirements for going into closed session, as well as gives guidance to anyone that may be listening as to what will happen at the end of that closed session. That's in paragraph 4. And the council meeting will be reopened in order to formally adjourn the meeting after the conclusion of the closed session.
Questions of Ms. Manderscheid? If not, Council, I would look for a motion directing the closure of a public meeting of the City Council.
Mr. Mayor, sorry, just one quick question related to practicalities. I know we are going into a separate WebEx meeting for this portion of the meeting. And then are we coming back to this WebEx meeting to adjourn, or will we be adjourning from that other WebEx meeting?
Good question, Councilmember Coulter. Here's how we're going to do it. As we go into closed session here, all of us will close this version of this WebEx meeting and log into another private WebEx meeting. We will conduct our business, our closed session business. This meeting will officially stay open, or open in terms of, I think Ms. Wilson is actually going to stay on the line, so basically to leave this meeting open. As we finish up our closed session business, we have to come back virtually to this meeting so we can have enough folks here to take an adjournment vote and close it here. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Council, we need a motion to close this public, or we need a motion to direct the closure of a public meeting of the City Council.
So moved.
We have a motion by Councilmember Coulter and a second by Councilmember Carter to adopt the resolution directing the closure of a public meeting of the City Council. Hearing no further discussion, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you. Beloga?
Aye.
Mayor Bussey?
Aye.
Carter?
Aye.
Coulter?
Aye.
Loman?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. With that, we will go into closed session. So, folks, if you would close this window, this meeting that we're in now, and I know that Chris sent you a second meeting invite to the private session, and we will see you shortly. We're now back out of closed session. I think you're turned up. I'm off as well. I'm muted. Council, with the end of our agenda, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Beloga, so moved.
Second, Councilmember Loman.
Got a motion by Beloga and a second by Loman to adjourn. Hearing no further discussion, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you. Beloga?
Aye.
Mayor Bussey?
Aye.
Sorry. Carter?
Aye.
Coulter?
Aye.
Loman?
Aye.
Martin? Nelson?
Aye.
7-0. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much for your time this evening. Thanks to the staff for your work tonight. Thank you very much. Everybody, next week, it's our first Monday off in 9 weeks. Enjoy your Labor Day weekend. Thanks much, everybody. We'll see you on the 14th, if not sooner. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Folks.